didn't have to say anything. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the auditorium and viewing the live stream online. My name is Trip Cardiff. I am the Director of Education here at the San Antonio Museum of Art, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's program, Seeing Mesoamerican Color with Kristopher Driggers. As always, our lectures and artist talks are made possible by generous support from the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund. Before we begin, a few friendly reminders. First, please take a moment to ensure that your phone is either turned off or set to silent. Second, if you need to excuse yourself from the auditorium at any point during the program, we ask that you please use the doors located to the rear, and you can re-enter the same way. Third, during the question and answer component of the program, we ask that you please raise your hand to ask a question. Dr. Driggers will call on you, and then he'll paraphrase or repeat the question for the benefit of the audience and for the folks at home. And finally, our galleries do close at 7 p.m., but we hope that you'll return soon to visit SAMA, including our current focus exhibition, Maya Blue, Ancient Color, New Visions, which is open now through May 2026. Our speaker this evening is Kristopher Driggers, who serves as SAMA's own Associate Curator of Latin American Art. A specialist in art of the ancient Americas, he has curated exhibitions and authored publications on topics such as textiles from the Andes, Maya visual narratives, and the work of contemporary artists in dialogue with ancient American traditions. He also studies the history of the collecting and circulation of ancient American art in the United States, especially in the Southwest. Dr. Driggers was previously the Associate Curator, Bernard and Jeanette Schmidt Curator of Latin American Art at the Tucson Museum of Art, and he holds a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago and a BA in the history of art from Yale University. Tonight, we enter the vibrant world of ancient Mesoamerica, where color is not just for decoration. From azure blues to earthy reds, artists across Maya, Aztec, and Zapotec traditions used color to express important concepts and shape meaning. Dr. Driggers will guide us through exciting new discoveries thanks to the work of archaeologists, material scientists, linguists, and artists that are reshaping how we understand color in these rich traditions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristopher Driggers.
Thank you so much, Trip, for introducing me, and thank you to all of you who are here in the room with us to talk about Mesoamerican color. Thank you also to those who are joining by the live stream, and I will do my best to talk loudly and clearly so that those on the live stream can hear me. Could I please have the lights down? Thank you. All right, so the title of my talk tonight is Seeing Mesoamerican Color, and I've given this talk this title for a really intentional kind of reason. I think that seeing Mesoamerican color is a little bit more complicated than it might initially sound. Mesoamericans in ancient Mesoamerica experienced a vibrant world of perceived color, just as we do who perceive color. But that perception of color was really shaped and framed by the context of a cultural experience and a cultural framework for thinking about color. And so one of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight is what we know about the kind of cultural framing of color that ancient Mesoamericans used to see and understand the world. We're also going to be talking about materials, because in works of art, materials embodied color. Materials made it possible to see color. And over the past 2 decades, we've learned lots and lots of new things about Mesoamerican materials and the kinds of things that Mesoamerican artworks were created with. But before we get into any of those topics, we're going to start right here at home. This is an artwork that you might have already seen upstairs in our galleries. This is a work by a San Antonio artist named Orlando Briceño, and the title of this work is Verde Azul, or Green Blue. The image program of the work is a series of expressions or terms that are related to the meanings of green and blue in Mesoamerican tradition. Let me read the text for you. It says, verde azul, agua, vegetación, hierba fresca, maíz tierno, juventud, abundancia, comida. These are terms like green, blue, water, vegetation, fresh herbs, young maize, youth, abundance, comida, food. These are the kinds of associations that the ancient Maya and other Mesoamericans brought to their understanding of the colors green and blue. Green and blue both framed as a single color in the Mesoamerican tradition. These lights are actually perfect, so let's keep these. A little bit more about Briceño's work. Interestingly, in this piece, Briceño often works on a support that's really quite distinctive to his choice and to his intention. He often makes works on dish towel supports. That's the case for this work. He does this because he's interested in Mexican-American experiences of domesticity. He thinks of the table as a place of cultural encounter. But in this work, what's really special is that he wanted to draw our attention specifically to color. And for that reason, instead of painting these terms onto his support, he's actually laid the ground up kind of raw pigment onto a kind of wax lining. He's signaling to us that it's color that's important and color that carries all of these important meanings. It's also a piece, of course, that ties ancient heritage to today. And that topic, kind of tying and thinking about the ancient in relationship to the contemporary, is at the heart of the exhibition Maya Blue, the exhibition that's upstairs. I hope that some of you may have already seen the exhibition, but in case you haven't, this is a show that's about a really special blue pigment that the ancient Maya and other Mesoamericans used and innovated, the Maya particularly in the first millennium AD. It's a very special color. It's an extract of indigo that dyes a special white clay called paligorskite, and it's a highly resilient kind of color. It's color fast. It sort of holds on to its color. Because the clay that was used to make this color was not widely available, was difficult to source, Maya blue was both rare, it was scarce, and it was precious. And so for the Maya, all of these ideas, the kind of scarcity of this pigment, its resilience and its fixity, all of these made Maya blue really special. Because of that specialness, Maya blue was used to color important objects of offering, like the object that we see here. This is one of the works from our Sama collection that's featured in the exhibition. More about it later. But before I get too deep into my talk, I want to say something about Mesoamerica, because I know that while this term might be familiar to some of us in the room, it probably is not familiar to everyone here. Mesoamerica. The term literally means Middle America, that's Meso, middle. And Mesoamerica refers to a cultural tradition that flourished in antiquity for over 2 millennia and that continues to be expressed by indigenous peoples of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador today. We think of Mesoamerica kind of classically as extending from central Mexico and parts of northern Mexico into Honduras, but we know that there are expressions of Mesoamerican culture in a much wider region, including in the US Southwest. On this map that's from the Maya Blue exhibition, you see an approximation, kind of a close approximation of the Mesoamerican cultural region. The Maya region is in red. What's important to know is that Mesoamericans, there are many distinct civilizations, like I mentioned. There are still speakers of Mesoamerican languages living in the nations of Mesoamerica today and also in the United States. So these traditions continue to thrive. But beyond that, although we're talking about many different traditions, we're also talking about a world where people shared many aspects of culture in common. Many Mesoamericans share a famous calendar system of 2 interlocking calendars, one used for divination and the other for telling the passage of the seasons that kind of lock together. That's one thing that most Mesoamericans seem to share. Many Mesoamericans also seem to share a ball game played with a very heavy rubber ball that I bet some of you might be familiar with. But some of the things that Mesoamericans share have to do directly with color. And how Mesoamericans think about space is actually one of those things that tells us something about color. In Mesoamerican worldviews, Mesoamerican understandings of the cosmos, all of space is divided into 5 cardinal directions. There's north, south, east, and west, and then the center is also an important direction in Mesoamerican traditions. And color plays in that each of these directions is actually characterized by a different color. On the image that you're seeing here, this is kind of a cosmic map or a cosmogram painted onto an important codex now stewarded in Liverpool in Great Britain. And you see here this kind of mapping of each of the cardinal directions, these kind of large sections. They're framed with different bands of color. And that's because, like I mentioned, in Mesoamerican conceptions of space, different directions have color. Directionality has color. The one that seems to kind of carry most frequently is that the direction of east, where the sun rises, is often colored red in many Mesoamerican cultures, right? The heat of the sun, the kind of red of the rising sun of morning, right? These are the colors of east in many Mesoamerican traditions. The other colors kind of change depending on where you are locally. So Mesoamericans share thinking about space with color. Another thing that lots of Mesoamerican cultures share is that many Mesoamerican cultures had political structures in which political elites actually led military campaigns in order to have access to materials that were valued for color. Kind of a simpler way of saying this, right? Mesoamericans wanted things that were desirable in part because of the rarity of their color. And they created trade relationships and sometimes conquest relationships in order to get access to some of those kinds of things. I'm showing you 2 of the star pieces from Sama's collection of ancient Mesoamerican art. On the left, we're looking at a Mixtec mask made of wood, laid with turquoise mosaic. That turquoise was almost certainly brought from the American Southwest, where there were sort of deposits of that turquoise, all the way to central Mexico, quite a long distance, through a trading relationship. And it was, of course, desirable because of its fantastic color. In the work that you see on the right, this pair of pendants, perhaps ornaments for ears, we see the heads of 2 gods in profile. And of course, if you're looking at the ears, you see that each of these ear ornaments wears its own ear ornaments. They're wearing jades for the ears. That jade, too, was from a very restricted geographical range. That jade's really found in a single river valley in Guatemala, the Motagua River Valley. And so Mesoamericans, like the ancient Maya, would have had to trade long distances, perhaps, in order to have access to that colored material. With all of that said, when we walk into galleries, museum galleries, art museum galleries of Mesoamerican art, we often don't have color at top of mind. And there's a reason for this, right? Oftentimes, the monumental objects that we sort of best know and are most interested in Mesoamerican art, oftentimes these monumental objects don't conserve a lot of their original color. 2 more of our star pieces from Sama's Mesoamerican collection. On the left, we have what's called an Atlantean figure. Called this because he seems to be holding something. That something was probably a bench at the site of Chichen Itza in Mexico or another related site. Doesn't seem to have a lot of color at first glance. Although I'll invite you, next time you're in our galleries, get close to the sculpture and you'll see that there are little bits of green and blue pigment still on this sculpture. That'll be kind of we'll call it a challenge for next time. Why not? Oops. I'm talking about the sculpture on the left. Do you see my mouse? No, but the sculpture on the left has color still on it. And in order to see this, you'll get close when you're in the gallery, and you'll see that on its right ear flare, its earring where you see a face, there's color there, and there's color close to the necklaces. And both of these have blue and green. It also has red paint on its back. That's by comparison. So when we look at other sculptures of the same type, they seem to have been in context where there would have been benches that held these sculptures, excuse me, that these sculptures once held. So there are sculptures that do conserve lots of their original color, but they're relatively few in number, and oftentimes they're really fragmentary. We're looking at a sculpture from the Mexica tradition of Tenochtitlan. This is the center of the Aztec Empire here. And here you see that this sculpture retains lots of its original color. But the sculpture itself, not so well conserved, right? We couldn't say with any precision what this sculpture represents. We can't see the head, we don't have all of the legs, and not even all of the color is preserved. And yet, when that color is conserved, a sculpture like this one becomes really important. But there are ways of learning about Mesoamerican color, even if we don't always appreciate it. And what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is tell you about 3 ways that Mesoamerican color has been studied. And these are all kind of recent findings about Mesoamerican color. The first is about language. Terms in Mesoamerican languages tell us all kinds of interesting things about color. And as a preview here, what I'll say is that some of these language terms show us that color is not thought of as kind of an abstract thing in some Mesoamerican traditions, like the tradition of the Maya. Instead, color has this kind of materiality, right? It refers to a material referent, and that's kind of built into the term, right? So it's not as if there's such a thing as whiteness that's separated from white materials that the Maya worked with and engaged with. More examples coming soon. We are also going to talk about material science, because in the last kind of 2 decades, there have been lots of new studies of the materials of Mesoamerican art, sometimes using new techniques, sometimes correcting bad research that happened in the past, and I'm going to tell you about both of these things and how they're giving us some new ideas about Mesoamerican color, what it is, and how it was used. And then finally, I'll make a few points about artists and the research that contemporary artists are doing today to help us to better understand ancient Mesoamerican color also. I'll just say from the get-go that I have more to say about the first of these 2 topics, and my remarks about artistic research will be what's the word I want to use? Kind of kept to the works that are currently on view at SAMA. But we'll get there. So first, language. One of the really interesting things about Mesoamerican traditions is that we know that Mesoamericans wrote in texts. They developed written languages and scripts. And for a long time, the ability of scholars to understand these hieroglyphic inscriptions and other kinds of inscriptions was pretty limited. But since the 80s, we have made huge advances, epigraphers have made huge advances in understanding what it is that Maya texts say and how Maya languages communicate, so that today we actually have a pretty good idea about what the Maya wrote about. And I'm showing you one of our standout works from the Mesoamerican collection again here on the slide. This is a very important cup from the site of Iq in Guatemala. And it's important for all kinds of reasons, but one of them is that it has hieroglyphic inscriptions on its surface that tell us the name of the artist. This is the only artwork in our ancient American galleries where we know who made it, right? And you can imagine why, right? Very few of the artworks in our collection have legible script on them, but in this case, we know the artist was a courtly painter named Tubal-Ahau. His inscription, you don't see my arrows, but that's okay. His signature is actually, if you look at the big seated lord who's at the center of this cup rollout, it's just behind him, in front of the female figures who accompany him in black. Just so I get a sense of this, can you nod if you see where his signature is? Great, okay, good. So, it's the one that's at the middle, right? The top is something else. The top is actually the dedication of the cup, and that's really common on Maya vessels. But it's the one that's kind of close to what would be like the skirt of the female figure at the center of this image, right? So this is the signature of this artist, right? Thanks to these kinds of texts, we know all kinds of things about Maya tradition. We know the names of artists, we know about Maya histories, we know about the political campaigns waged by Maya rulers, lots of rich information in these texts. And some of the information in these texts tells us something about color. And like I mentioned just a moment ago, in Maya inscriptions, we see that the terms that are used for colors are often kept really close to kind of a material referent, right? They're not just abstractions, but they're close to the materials themselves. I'll start with the color at the center of the exhibition, Maya blue. This is a color that the Maya called yash, and it encompasses both what we would call blues and greens. And we're gonna look first at its hieroglyph. I'm gonna say a little bit about what each of 4 colors means, right? And where their hieroglyphs seem to have come from. Its glyph has markings that suggest something polished or something shiny. If you look at the center of the glyph kind of towards the bottom, that marking that it has on its kind of inside, this is the marking for shiny things. Shiny, polished, blue and green, right? Here we're thinking about something like polished jade as the material reference for the sign for blue and green. This term yash, it connotes newness and freshness and unripeness, right? You're thinking about the green stalks of corn that are sprouting up, kind of ready, but not quite ready to eat, right? Growing and developing, but not yet ripe. By extension, it also connotes moisture, that blue-green of water, right? Here, there's kind of a natural kind of connection, almost a self-referential connection in this blue and green. The vegetal, that's part of yash. But then ironically, it also, at the same time we have this hardness, this polishedness, and this vegetalness, they all kind of exist together at the same time in yash. One of the interesting things about yash is that, and all of these Maya terms, is that at the same time that they refer to colors, they also have secondary meanings. And so one of the secondary meanings of yash, and it's not even right to say secondary, I would say sort of equally and alternately in play, right, is an idea of firstness or primacy. Yash is not just blue-green, yash is also firstness. And the same idea comes for talking about things like the cosmic origins of humans. Humans were Yashwini Ko'ob, the first of humanity, back when humanity was sort of still not ripe and ready to eat, right? This is this firstness that's implied by this term. Something else that's special about yash is that it's the only of the color terms that you can reduplicate to intensify. So there's a term that exists that's yash, kind of 2 times yash, that means something like very yash. So it's special in this way, yash. Now we pass to blue's opposite. In the kind of ideology of color, the opposite of blue is yellow in the Maya in Maya ideology and inscriptions. The glyph for yellow is a solar disk, and the reason that blue is kind of the opposite of yellow is that if blue meant unripe, yellow means ripe and ready to eat, right? Like maize, once the plant is kind of yellow with its good ready kernels, right, everything is good and ready to be consumed. By extension, yellow also connotes prosperity, right, and abundance, and these are kind of integral, important parts of how yellow was understood. Yet, yellow can, oh dear. Someone will come and save me, I think. What do I do? All right. Did I kick it? I probably kicked it, right? All right. I can't move. Okay. So yellow connotes ripeness, readiness for consumption, to be eaten, but it also is used in expressions for dryness. There's a term that's something like kanah or kanahil. This is a yellow house, and this is probably referring to something like a house made with a dry thatched roof, right? So there's that idea of yellow in play. That dryness also makes yellow blues opposite. And then there are some other kind of interesting, also in play expressions around yellow. Yellow is used for terms around honor. For instance, in an expression that's still used in contemporary Maya communities today, the term canche, which means a seat of honor, is one of these terms that's also in play. The term for red is the one we'll look at next. The term is chalk. And chalk has, just like the other terms, a kind of coincidence of meanings, right? There's red that's in play, but there's also the idea of great, and there's also the idea of ferocious. A great lord or a big lord is a chak ahau. That word ahau means lord in ancient Maya texts. And the term for the thigh bone in contemporary Maya communities is the chak bakel, or the big bone, right? Makes sense, one of the big bones in your body. It's also, this term chalk has another meaning, like I said, that implies kind of ferocity. And interestingly, it's not on the slide, but there's this other kind of alternative meaning to chalk that's about heat, for reasons that you can probably imagine that seem to kind of make sense, right? When a person is described as being feverish, having kind of a heat in the body, their body is full of chaklil, lots of kind of redness in contemporary Mayan expressions. We really are so fortunate to have the knowledge of contemporary indigenous communities that steward Maya language, because they help us to understand the meanings of these ancient terms in ways that we might not otherwise be able to do. The glyph of chalk, right? It itself comes from a fleshed bone. The older version of the glyph is the version on the bottom. You can sort of see this is a bone kind of stripped of its flesh, right? It evolved to look like the glyph on top. All of these glyphs have kind of distant iconographic origins that say something about them. But if there's a favorite color that I have of these four colors that we're talking about, in terms of its conceptualization, it's sak, or white. And the reason for this is that sak encompasses not just white as a color, but also ideas of things that are made by human craft, and things that are beautiful by extension. Weaving is part of what is encompassed into this idea of white. We'll start with the sign first, right? The sign, we don't know exactly what its kind of iconographic origin is, but one of my senior colleagues has proposed that it might be based on a white flower, and it sort of looks a little bit floral in its glyph. In addition to the whiteness that's part of its meaning, like I said, it also connotes things that are made by human hands. These are sometimes translated as artificial, but not artificial in the sense of fake, but rather artificial in the sense of like made through human making, right? Objects of making are thought of as sak. And by extension, things that are beautiful are spoken about as having a kind of sakal in contemporary Mayan languages. That idea, sakal, also means woven thing. So someone's weaving is kind of metaphorically also their whiteness. And the idea here is that the term might originate in the white cotton woven by Maya weavers, when undyed would have had that kind of white color, right? There's a very material sort of reference for this particular term in Maya languages. We turn now from the Maya to look at traditions of central Mexico. And in central Mexican sources, some of our most rich information about color does not come from hieroglyphic inscriptions, but it comes instead from alphabetic texts. I'm showing you a page here from a manuscript called the Florentine Codex. This is a manuscript that was written by a group of Nawa scholars and scribes working in collaboration with Franciscan friars just a few decades after the conquest of Mexico around 1585. And their effort in collecting this information and compiling this information was to create a kind of encyclopedic recounting of all of the things of pre-Spanish Mexico in textual form and in images. This is one of our very most precious sources about indigenous Mexico. And the particular page that we're looking at here is about the collecting of cochineal. I bet that this is a substance or a colorant that some of you have heard of before, and here in Texas perhaps even seen, because cochineal is the red pigment that's taken from the bugs that live on kind of the leaves of the nopal cactus, right? You see someone has very helpfully uploaded onto Wikimedia Commons photos of themselves collecting this cochineal. It creates a really quite beautiful red that when mixed with different kinds of additives can produce a whole range of different reds into pinks and dark purples. The Florentine Codex shows us an illustration of the collecting of that cochineal. Here at the center, you see the nopal plant, the cactus, with all of its cochineal bugs on its fronds. And at right, you see someone painting a manuscript using that cochineal, while another figure nearby, it looks to me like they're sort of processing the pigment for making. But we're talking about language, and what we have in the Florentine Codex are some really interesting terms for cochineal, and also they're terms that tell us something about how indigenous Nahuas thought about color. The names for the color actually changed depending on whether it was the raw, unprocessed color or whether it was refined. When it was raw or unprocessed, the Nahua term is nochestli. Nochtli is the nopal, and estli is blood. And so together, this term for cochineal, raw cochineal, is nochestli, nopal blood. Once it's been refined to be used for dyeing or for painting, it becomes tlacoahuac tlapali. That's cochineal that's sort of ready to use. And then finally, and I think this is sort of especially nice, the manuscript also tells us about how it was sold at the market. So artists who wanted to buy some of this pigment to use it in artworks would have bought it shaped into a tlaxcali, or a little tortilla or a pancake of color. And so you would sort of buy the ground pigment ready to be kind of reconstituted to be used as paint in that way. That's a nice detail we get from this manuscript. I think I should take questions at the end. I'm sorry, but I promise there will be time, and if not, you'll tell me and I'll answer your question. Let me keep going. Finally, I would note that in terms of language, we find that there were different colors. Nahua scribes and thinkers understood different kinds of hierarchies of colors. Because they're at work making a book, it may be that they kind of prioritized the colors that were used for painting books first, right? But there are colors that are good for painting books. There are colors that are used for dyeing cloth. And then there are different paints that are used, different colorants that are used for kind of everything else, sculpture, pottery, murals, and so on. And now we'll turn to material science. Just a second. So just as scholars and curators have not always been attentive to color in our work, thinking about ancient Mesoamerica, it is also true that artworks have not always been conserved in ways that were sensitive to their color. And I'm showing you one of these examples here on the slide. You're looking at an important work from the center of Tenochtitlan, the kind of imperial center of the Aztec Empire, created by Mexica artists late in indigenous Central Mexican history. This is the Coyolxauhqui monument, and it's a monumental depiction of a goddess whose body has been quartered. You see that her legs, sort of all of her limbs are sort of torn from her trunk on this monument because she has betrayed the Mexica's patron deity, Huitzilopochtli. It is a powerful, large-scale monument, a monument that once was part of a program that represented an important Mexica myth at the site of Tenochtitlan. It sort of laid on the floor at the time that it was discovered, and almost certainly in antiquity. And at the time it was discovered, it was found in 1978, and it was a huge find. This was the first big monumental sculpture that had been found from the Aztec period, from the Aztec Empire, in quite a long time, right, in decades, and perhaps the most important find in more than a century. And so there was a lot of excitement about the find. And the president of Mexico was one of the people who was very excited about it, and he, this was President Jose López Portillo. He wanted to have a kind of photo op with the sculpture, and so everyone rushed to clean the sculpture in 6 days. Too fast. The color was not conserved on the sculpture. As my senior colleague in Mexico, Leonardo López Luján, recounts in a recent article about the polychromy of this sculpture. So today, when we look at it without other aids, we see that it's a sculpture that seems to have this kind of neutral, kind of non-polychromy, right? No pigment. But that's not what it looked like in antiquity. Before there was this reconstruction, people were trying to figure out what the color of the sculpture was like, and they turned to Aztec painted books and Mixtec painted books to look for other examples. They thought that the sculpture might have originally had 11 colors, which is quite a lot. But a team recently, led by López Luján, who I just mentioned, took another look at the sculpture using very kind of high power microscopy, and with a really kind of attentive, long-term study of the entire sculpture's surface, they were able to find that there were actually 4 pigments on this sculpture. And I'm going to add one more fact. What they found was that all of the pigments on the sculpture actually had mineral sources. This is really important because we see that, this is a big stone sculpture, right? And it has stony kind of mineral pigments, things from the earth that are used to color the sculpture. That is different from what we'll see in just a moment when we look at books from the same part of the world and the same time period, where most of the colors we think come from plants and organics and things like flowers. Those are different colors. The way that the color of the sculpture has been restituted today is that when we look at this in the museum where it's now displayed, its color is actually projected. They have kind of a high power projector over the sculpture that projects some of its color some of the time, so that you get a sense of what its polychromy might have been like. And museums in Mexico are doing all kinds of clever things to try to give us a sense of what the color of ancient sculpture might have been like. Sometimes they are admittedly kind of difficult to engage with because they're so different from how we're used to looking at the color of ancient American art. This is a side-by-side. The one, obviously the one on the left is what this color of this sculpture actually looks like in the gallery. The one on the right is the restituted color, to use this team's term. But they have not only tried to restitute its color, they're also trying to restitute its surface. So their hypothesis is that this is really what the surface of the sculpture might have looked like. I'll add that for my colleagues in the room who work on Greek and Roman contexts, I know that it's not only in Mesoamerican art that these kinds of experiments are being done in museums. This was a show in the ancient Mediterranean galleries at the Met that had kind of the same idea just a few years ago of showing kind of replicas, reproductions, it's not quite the right word, but reconstructions of what the color might have looked like on ancient sculpture in those galleries also. Often to mixed reception, these kinds of shows in general, right? Because again, it's sort of seeing the color reconstitute in this way is, it's new, right? We are not accustomed to seeing works. We have an idea about what the aesthetic of the work is like that doesn't take its color into account. I did want to mention a happy story in terms of the conservation of color, because in 2006, there was a major new discovery of an Aztec monolith. Again, a huge find of a monumental sculpture at the center of Mexico City, ancient Tenochtitlan. Here we're looking at a monumental deity sculpture representing an earth deity. And you'll see that in this case, it was really sort of carefully and slowly conserved. The team took almost 1.5 years to let the sculpture dry. It was kind of caked in mud after spending 5 centuries at the bottom of what we know it was historically kind of a lake-filled basin environment, right? Today, because they took this kind of careful, assiduous cleaning of the sculpture so seriously, right, the sculpture maintains much of its original color. And you'll see here a reconstruction of the kind of visualization of what that color likely looked like in antiquity, and how it looks today when you see it at the museum. In terms of material science, another area where we have lots of new information comes from a team called MoLab. This means Mobile Laboratory. This team has put together a set of analytical tools that they can use and take to different repositories where there are important Mesoamerican monuments. They're using technologies like XRF and digital microscopy and all kinds of other tools to be able to identify the pigments of Mesoamerican manuscripts in European collections. They're based in large part out of the University of Bologna in Italy. And one of the manuscripts where they've spent a lot of time really intensively analyzing the pigments is the manuscript you're seeing here on the screen. This is the Codex Cospi. It is a manuscript for divination. Every day in the Mesoamerican calendar had a specific fate, and this was the kind of manuscript used to ascertain what the fate of any particular day was. In terms of color, the team went about identifying the materials. The manuscript is painted onto the support of a deer hide. That deer hide is overlaid with gesso in the form of gypsum. And then some of the colors, cochineal, which we have already seen, this kind of organic pigment with its brilliant red right from the nopal cactus. That was one of the reds. But they also found, and this was exciting, a second organic dye for red. And that second red, they believe, was almost certainly achiote. I bet a lot of us know what that is. Does everyone know what cochinita pibil is? Cochinita pibil is the seed pods that are used to kind of create all the flavor, the annatto flavor in that plate. This is achiote. Also an important pigment used as kind of a lake pigment in Mesoamerican codices from plants, right? All of these plant pigments have such a brilliant kind of color that I think was part of what they were valued for. The black they identified was also an organic. This is okot or soot. And the yellow turned out to be trickier to identify. But on the back of this manuscript, they actually found traces of a really interesting yellow. This is from a mineral pigment. This is called orpiment. And there are deposits of this in northern Mexico, in the states of Chihuahua and Sonora, not so far from here in San Antonio. This was the yellow used for a very brilliant yellow on the back of the manuscript that was a little bit different. I'll kind of click back. You can sort of see, I hope, I know it's hard to look at color on a projected screen, but you can see some of the difference even here, I think, between these yellows. One more finding from MoLab, they also found that some of the colors on these Mesoamerican manuscripts were found by overlaying different colors. So to achieve green in some areas of the back of this manuscript, the Codex Cospi, they laid down a layer of Maya blue and then covered it with another layer of yellow, and that layering of the color produced greens. And if you look closely at the manuscript, even kind of one of my colleagues did this even without microscopy, but with kind of naked eye observation. You can see places where you can get a sense of how the colors were laid one on top of the other. So Mesoamericans had access to tremendous ranges of color and innovative ways of laying down and working with color to give them greater expressive range. Finally, in my talk, I'm going to say a little bit about artists, contemporary artists, and the kinds of research that they do that helps us to see Mesoamerican color in a new light. And I'm going to start with a work towards this end. Not a work that's in Maya Blue, but a work that's on view in the exhibition Ready Made Remix, just up the stairs and in our contemporary galleries. This is a work by the artist Patrick Martinez, who's based in Los Angeles. And it's a work that's large in scale and incorporates many different media. Patrick does not himself work in his practice with ancient Mesoamerican colors, but I did write about his work and interviewed him for a project at my previous institution because he has worked a lot with and engaged a lot with paintings from ancient Mesoamerica. Here you see that he has depicted a jaguar warrior on the one corner of his large-scale wall, right? I should say this entire kind of work is meant to kind of evoke the urban landscape and incorporates elements of signage, both in traditional media and also in things like neon. And it also includes the idea or the evocation of a Mesoamerican painting made also for a wall on its surface. So we're seeing the walls of an ancient site, the ancient site of Cacaxtla in the state of Tlaxcala, kind of transposed onto the surface of Patrick's work. When we were talking about this body of work, Patrick told me that he thought of the paintings of Cacaxtla as some of the most elegant or exquisite kind of representations of ancient Mesoamerican traditions. Really kind of, they resonated with him as particularly elegant expressions. And we discussed the idea that maybe some of the neon in his paintings might evoke the way that the organic pigments laid onto Mesoamerican walls and manuscripts have their own kind of brilliance, and that sort of resonated with him. He kind of liked that interpretation. And so I bring it in here also. Please go see this exhibition, Ready Made Remix, and also take a look at Patrick's work to learn more about this. And with that, we come to one of the artists from the Maya Blue exhibition now. This is Sandy Rodriguez, a Chicana artist who lives and works in Los Angeles also. Sandy has been really at the forefront of working with Mesoamerican colors. She looks for color, she sort of forages for color in her own practice. Part of what she does as an artist involves kind of going out into the landscape and looking for things like the pods of plants that were used in antiquity to produce organic colors, and then doing research on the kind of recipes needed to reconstitute those colors so that she can use them in her own practice. This is kind of a self-portrait of Sandy collecting color that she created during the time of the pandemic, imagining herself kind of out in the landscape collecting some of these flowers that she uses as pigments. The studio is really important to Sandy's practice. You can see some examples here of the kinds of paints that she uses in her studio. This is a small scale work where you see all of her different color swatches, where she's really working out what those colors look like. Importantly, as Sandy and I were talking about kind of the work that she's done reconstituting these colors, she noted to me that it was important to her that the colors look different when they're painted onto a mate paper. She paints onto this fig bark tree paper that was traditionally used in Mesoamerican manuscripts. And that paper, that support, is part of the coloration of the pigments that she produces also. So a really important part of her practice. I show you here the work that's in view in Maya Blue, Ancient Color New Visions. This is an image that references one of the paintings of the Florentine Codex, the encyclopedia of indigenous Nahua life that we saw earlier in this talk. It's a painting from a series that Sandy calls her Healers, and they were painted just before the pandemic in 2019. They are both images of indigenous Nahua women drawn from Mesoamerican manuscripts, but they are also portraits of women who have been Sandy's collaborators in exploring Mesoamerican color. This is at the same time as it is a Florentine Codex reference. It's also a portrait of Diana Magaloni Kerpel, who is one of the researchers. I'm a curator and a researcher into Mesoamerican color. Her likeness is the face of this figure. And for this work, Sandy actually created Maya Blue paint that she applied to what are drops of dew at the top and side of this work. The reference is to a kind of form of indigenous medicine, collecting dew from plants, fresh dew, to treat the viral infections of infants. That is the reference here. And it's Maya Blue, this potent, powerful color, this first color, as we saw, this kind of primal color that is part of the kind of magic and the medicine and the knowledge that make the treatment, the remedy for this infection possible. I invite you to see this work and all of the other works in Maya Blue, Ancient Color, New Visions. And I thank you for your attention to this talk, and I am now happy to take your questions. Thank you. I'll start with hand up. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. So I'm supposed to repeat the questions as I answer, right? 2 questions. How do we know what these look like, right? How did they know? I'll answer that part first, and then I'll also repeat the second question. So the bugs are observable, right? You know, oftentimes what you're seeing, the kind of foamy stuff that's on the nopal plant, as I understand it, those are the eggs. But you can also see the kind of full of acid, red acid bug on the nopal fronds also, right? And they're photographable, right? They're not so microscopically small that they can't be seen. And then the second question is about preparation to be a paint, like preparation for use in artworks. There are lots of different things that we know were done for the processing of the cochineal, right? It's dried, it's clean, and then it often has little bits of alum added to it to kind of create a range of color. This is, I think that makes this a lake pigment, but this would make this, it both stabilizes the cochineal in order to make it kind of usable and to keep its red kind of integral. And it also, you know, depending on what kind of recipe you use, you can really get tremendous ranges out of cochineal. Like I mentioned, it can go from very dark to quite light, almost pink. There's a great book about cochineal. There was an exhibition project called Cochineal, the Red That Colored the World in 2015 that was put together by the Museum of International Folk Art. And I really highly recommend the catalog, which speaks about all of this at greater length. I'm gonna move on to another. Okay, so the second question is about how materials are applied to the surfaces, right? And Mesoamericans have I'm going to answer the question as I understood it, and then you can come down after if I've misunderstood it. But there's a kind of wide toolkit in Mesoamerican artistic practices. We know about brushes. We know that Mesoamericans are dyeing with cochineal, right? There are dyed textiles. And so it can really be applied in a wide range of techniques. Okay, can I take another question over here? I mean, I think that the plants are damaged, right, in this process, right? You're using some of their materials, right? And depending on what part of the plant you're using, right, it may be that that damages the plant, right? But Mesoamericans also had significant knowledge about stewarding and about taking care of agricultural heritage. And so this was part of an ecosystem of both care for plants and then also using them for their usable properties. Some kinds of things had to be traded for really long distances also, and would have been inherently precious, right? It's not, there are colorants, not just plants, but also minerals, like purple shells that were used for creating sort of purple pigments, purple colorants. Those had to be traded from coasts. When you're looking for something rare and scarce, you take good care of it in transport. And so I imagine that that is part of it also. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Yeah. Okay, 2 great questions, right? Or 2 great points. So the first, and I'll repeat it for everyone who's on the live stream, is the recommendation of the book A Perfect Red. And The second is a point about, or a question about contemporary Mayan languages. So we know that there are still many speakers of Mayan languages today, right? As many as 32 Mayan languages, distinct languages, are still spoken in modern Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize today. And which languages give us terms? I think that it's fair to say that there are rich and distinct ideas about color in all of these languages. Many of the ones that I referenced come from Yucatec Mayan. There's two reasons for that. Yucatec Mayan is the Mayan language that I studied, but it's also it's a language that in the way that it's spoken today is really closely related to the language of the ancient Maya inscriptions. And so Yucatec is often a really rich language for understanding what kinds of ideas might have been expressed in ancient language also. But it's not only Yucatec. There are there are expressions that I spoke about today that come from Tzotzil. That's a Highland Maya language. In Quechua, in Lacandon gives us good information about Maya languages. The Lacandon communities were really extensively studied at kind of mid-century, and so there's lots of source texts about Lacandon Maya. And the best place for this, I'll kind of go back. I have it on the bottom of my slide. There's a book, since you mentioned a book, I'll mention a book too. There's a book by my colleagues led by Stephen Houston called Veiled Brightness that has a chapter about terms for color in different Maya languages that includes lots of references to lots of different Maya languages. It's published by UT Press, so that would be a good source for you also. Sure, go ahead. Right. So I cut it out because I was afraid I was going to talk for too long. But thank you for asking, because now I can mention it. So black, the term for black is ik, and it's in its sign, it has cross hatchings at the center of the sign that refer to darkness. And one of the interesting points made in the book that I just referenced by Houston and colleagues, Veiled Brightness, they argue that black is kind of interesting in that out of all of the colors, it actually has kind of the least range of alternate meanings. Black just kind of means black. Black means dark. Black means scary. But it doesn't mean, the things that, and when I say that, I should say black means the fear of things that are not perceptible in darkness, right? But that its meanings don't kind of range into metaphor as far as the other four kind of core terms in Maya color do. What we know about blacks in kind of materiality, right? One of the most important blacks comes from charred wood, right? Charred wood is kind of put into a pot, allowed to condense, and then that condensation becomes a black colorant that's used both in manuscripts and also sometimes on monumental sculpture. I think in European traditions that pigment is called lamp black, but I bet someone here knows better than I do. At any rate, it's this kind of tar, soot black in the Nahuatl language called okot. Thank you for asking about black. Yep, go ahead. No, so actually, it's writing in present tense, right? These things are still happening. The production of color doesn't end, and cochineal is a great example of this, right? When at the moment of Spanish colonization of Mexico, colors are highly tradable, they're highly desirable commodities on a global market, and cochineal is really a hot commodity, right? People, even in the Florentine Codex, they write that makers in Mexico are making cochineal that gets exported that ultimately ends up as far away as like Turkey. It's really traveling the world. And the exhibition I mentioned also discussed this. And so, I would actually, so I would push back on that just a little bit, right? And what I would say is that when you really look closely at Mesoamerican manuscripts, you start to see a lot of range in the way that the color's applied, right? I talked about layering of color onto color to get different color effects. Sometimes that kind of layering gives you wider ranges from dark to light that appear to almost have a kind of perspectival use of color. There are also cases where we know that different kinds of minerals, for example, minerals that have like crystal, are ground and incorporated into Mesoamerican colors in order to create a particular kind of sheen in some of the places where that color is applied. And so I guess what I would say is don't let the projection of these manuscripts onto this screen entirely color the kind of judgment about the way that color is used, because it's actually quite complex when you look closely at the manuscript. I think I have time for one more question, so go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And that's, so the comment was that when you see it in the gallery, the work by Rolando Briceño really has a kind of luminosity that it just doesn't have on the screen. And I'm actually glad that this is our last comment, because it's a perfect place to end. Please come back and see the exhibition. Thank you for letting me talk to you about color for an hour. Very essential.